The Technology History Podcast. Exciting stories about the development of technology by Christian Steinbach. Hi everybody, and welcome to the first episode in English of my Technology History Podcast. I am a German teacher and I am interested very much in history and in technology. So I started this podcast last year in German language. After 18 published episodes, my wife had the idea of translating some of them, which are interesting for people in other countries, into English. So this is my first try. Originally, it was episode number 10 about the Titanic phenomenon. And now, let's go. Even today, 112 years after her sinking, almost everyone can relate to the ship Titanic. But why is that? And this is exactly the question I want to explore in this episode. How can it be that 2 world wars and countless catastrophes later, the Titanic and its fate are still so present? How and why did it become such a myth? But before I address these questions in connection with the Titanic phenomenon, I would like to summarize the sober facts. The RMS Titanic was commissioned on 2nd of April in 1912 and, according to Wikipedia, was the largest ship in the world at this time. It had 2 sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic. By the way, RMS is short for Royal Mail Ship. It had this title because, in addition to passengers, it also carried mail. The Titanic was almost 270 meters long and over 28 meters wide, and displaced over 53,000 tons of water. For landlubbers, the mass of the water displaced corresponds to the mass of the ship. The Titanic weighed over 53,000 tons. The driving steam engines produced 51,000 horsepower, which brought the Titanic to a maximum speed of 24 knots. This corresponds to around 45 kilometers per hour. The construction of this superlative ship took exactly 3 years and was carried out by the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland, on behalf of the White Star Line. It was designed for 2,400 passengers and almost 900 crew. So much for the raw numbers, which may seem average compared to today's passenger and cruise ships, but in their time before the First World War, they dwarfed everything. In addition, the Titanic was equipped with everything that was conceivable in terms of luxury and was possible with the state-of-the-art at the time. For example, there was an onboard telephone network and a telegraph station. First-class passengers not only had access to extremely luxurious cabins, but also lounges, a swimming pool and a gym. Even the second and third-class facilities were comparatively luxurious by the standards of the time. The Titanic was fully electrified. The swimming pool was heated electrically and a variety of electrical appliances were used in the kitchen. Some of the 10,000 bulbs contained 2 filaments, one for brighter light and one for less bright light. The safety aspects were taken less seriously. The originally planned 48 lifeboats were reduced to 20, far too few for the actual number of people who would actually be on board. However, due to the modern double-wall steel construction and the bulkhead system, the Titanic was considered practically unsinkable anyway. Only after the disaster did it become law that every passenger on board a ship had to have a place in a lifeboat. The Titanic's first voyage took it from Southampton in England via Cherbourg in France and Queenstown in Ireland to New York in the USA. When the ship left Southampton on the 10th of April 1912, there was a critical incident. the Titanic almost collided with the ship New York, which the captain of a tugboat and the crew of the Titanic were only able to prevent. Passengers were taken in again in Cherbourg and Queenstown. Only a few left the ship here before the Titanic began its journey across the Atlantic in the early afternoon of 11th of April. Exactly what happened on the fateful night of 14th to 15th of April is difficult to reconstruct because, understandably, there are no original audio and photo documents from that night, and the survivors' statements sometimes contradict each other. In addition, statements made by surviving crew members before official investigative committees should be treated with great caution, as they could have had certain intentions. For example, to whitewash their own role and actions or to implicate the employee, this is the shipping company, or their superiors to take protection. Furthermore, the lower class survivors were not interviewed at all during the official investigations. It was only after Robert Ballard found the wreck in 1985 that many questions could be clarified, such as the fact that the ship had actually broken apart. Before I go into the memories of individual contemporary witnesses, here are the most important facts about the sinking, which can be viewed as reasonably certain. It was only immediately before the collision at 11:40 p.m. that the lookout discovered the iceberg and reported it to the bridge. The evasive maneuver that was immediately initiated failed, so that the starboard side, this is left, of the Titanic brushed against the iceberg over a considerable length, causing several small leaks to occur in the hull. This fact ensured that a critical amount of water was able to penetrate despite the bulkheads now being closed. About 20 minutes after the collision, it was clear to the ship's command that the Titanic would sink within less than 2 hours. As a result, emergency calls were telegraphed, signal rockets were fired, and the first lifeboats were launched. These were severely understaffed, as many passengers still believed the ship was unsinkable and, in keeping with seafaring tradition, only women and children were allowed into the boats. The actual time of sinking is assumed to be 2:17 a.m. After the lights went out, the Titanic broke up. The bow sank first, followed by the stern about 3 minutes later. It was only 2 hours later that the lifeboats with the survivors were gradually recovered by the Carpathia, which rushed to help. Of the 2,224 people who were on board the Titanic, only 710 were saved. But how did people experience the disaster? To get an idea of this, I watched interviews with people who survived the sinking of the Titanic. By the way, there are no more survivors now. Most recently, Milvina Dean, who witnessed the sinking as a baby, died in 2009. The oldest surviving audio document with an interview was recorded in 1937. It is a radio interview from Swiss Radio with Swiss Emma Arnold-Segesser, who came on board as an employee of a first-class passenger. It was created just 25 years after the accident, very close in time compared to those that were mostly created in the 1950s to the 1980s. You can find some videos with such interviews on YouTube. In any case, they all have one thing in common. Even decades later, you can still see the sheer horror in the eyes of the narrators. The traumatizing experiences must have left clear traces in the souls of these people. One of the videos shows Assistant Purser Prentice captured by Lifeboat 4 floating in the ice water. He reports how severely understaffed lifeboats were lowered because many women felt safer on the ship than in the boats. He emphasizes that at least 800 people could have been saved if the boats had been properly filled. Particularly touching is his story that he helped a young woman who was on her honeymoon in France with her husband with a life jacket and persuaded her to quickly get into a lifeboat. When he was floating in the water immediately after the sinking and was picked up by lifeboat 4, he found himself next to this young woman who warmed him with her coat and thus saved his life. Like other survivors, he mentions the nightmares and terrible memories that would overtake him every night. In a very soul-searching interview that was made following the discovery of the wreck in 1985, Eva Hart, who was 7 when the sinking occurred, reported not only on the sinking itself, but also on the premonitions of her mother, who also survived. She absolutely did not want to travel with the Titanic because this ship was tainted with blasphemies. It was said back then that not even God could sink the Titanic. Here, Eva Hart addresses what I believe to be an important aspect that ultimately founded the Titanic myth. With the Titanic, trust in the unconditional belief in technology of the early 20th century was lost. With the help of modern technology, people wanted to go higher and ended up, in the truest sense of the word, ice cold on the ground. Another thing that symbolically went down with the Titanic was a class society of the 19th century. Significantly more first-class passengers survived. Nevertheless, they were symbolically washed off their high horse and had to fight for survival in the ice water alongside the ordinary mortals. And just 2 years later, the First World War finally broke out and finally ended the period that is known in retrospect as the Belle Epoque, the beautiful epoch. So the Titanic became a symbol of the vulnerability and finitude of man himself and his creative power. In any case, the fact is that the Titanic was culturally processed immediately after its sinking, which continues with varying intensity to this day. The accident was filmed twice in the same year. Numerous documentaries and novels have also been written. There was enough material in any case. Is it true that the shipping company owner Bruce Ismay put Captain Edward Smith under pressure so that he let the Titanic sail through the iceberg zone much too quickly? In any case, the Titanic was demonstrably warned about icebergs. And did the protagonists, especially the officers and celebrities of the first class, really play the more or less heroic role that was expected of them? From the First to the Second World War, however, people had enough other worries to which they turned their attention. It was not until the 1950s that the Titanic came back into fashion, especially thanks to the Hollywood movie A Night to Remember. The science fiction movie Raise the Titanic from 1980 is noteworthy. This work, which was created before the wreck was found, assumes that the Titanic sank in only one piece and is still in fairly good condition. James Cameron triggered a real Titanic boom in 1997 with his movie Titanic, for which he even dived to the wreck himself. And the fascination is still going on. Diving trips always bring back new images of the wreck. A complete 3-dimensional scan was recently made, which was even discussed in the main news. But even on these diving trips, disasters are inevitable. In June 2023, a small submarine had an accident while diving for the Titanic, killing all 5 people on board. Finally, I would like to mention one last interesting aspect in connection with the Titanic. The novel, Futility, or the Wreck of the Titan, describes a ship that was considered the largest of its time and unsinkable. While sailing across the Atlantic in April, the Titan, which was not equipped with enough lifeboats, hit an iceberg and sank. And now here's the interesting thing. Robertson published the novel in 1898, 14 years before the real Titanic sank. Personally, I first dealt with the topic of Titanic in 1998 when I saw Cameron's movie in a small village cinema. Only this one time did I actually see the cinema filled to capacity. Another impact of the Titanic phenomenon. This was the first episode of the Technology History podcast in English titled The Titanic Phenomenon. If you enjoy the podcast, I would be very happy about a subscription. And maybe you know someone who is also interested in this topic and to whom you would like to recommend my podcast. Finally, my thanks go to Vocal Music from Pixabay, whose song I was allowed to incorporate into the intro. Thank you for your interest and see you next time on the Technology History Podcast.